Let's talk about something else that kind of operates under the hood with your Hadoop cluster, Oozie. Oozie orchestrates your Hadoop jobs. It's a little bit more hands-on because you do need to actually interact with it and configure it if you actually want to run your Hadoop jobs in production and chain things together in ways that they depend on each other. So let's talk about it in more depth. What is Oozie? Oh, it's just a cool sounding name for one thing. I want to say that name as much as I can during this lecture. The origin of the name is the Burmese word for elephant keeper, which is kind of fitting. And if you think about it, Oozie its entire job is to manage the periodic jobs that run on your cluster, on your Hadoop cluster. So it can actually organize multiple actions that you might run on various bits and pieces of Hadoop, tie them together into workflows, and then schedule those workflows to run on some periodic basis for you. So at a high level, it's just a system for running and scheduling Hadoop tasks. What does that mean? Well, the first concept in Oozie is something called a workflow, and this allows you to tie together different actions within Hadoop that might depend on each other. Now, you don't have to have multiple actions in a workflow. You might have a workflow that just does one thing, like run a Hive job or a Pig script or something like that, but you can also chain them together. So maybe you might have a MapReduce job that depends on a Hive job, that depends on a Pig job, that depends on a Scoop job, and a distcp job that's running together at the same time. You can set up any sort of structure that you want of dependencies between these different tasks and actually build a directed acyclic graph of these different actions that are tied together, and so it knows actually what depends on each other. And the way you specify this is just through an XML file. So this way you can specify a bunch of actions that might not depend on each other and specify it through your XML in such a way that Oozie can figure out that it can run those in parallel and not just run them sequentially. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Here's an example of what a workflow might look like in Oozie. So this is totally fabricated, and a workflow can be anything that you can dream up, really. But every workflow will have a start node and an end node, so that Oozie knows when to start and when to stop. And your start node will point to where to start from. So you can also have these fork nodes, and if you have a fork node, it will say go off and kick off these two actions, or more than two actions even, in parallel. So I might start with a fork node that says go kick off a Pig action and kick off a Scoop action at the same time. And maybe these are extracting data from two different sources that I need for my larger workflow. Like maybe I'm getting the top-rated movie IDs from Pig, and I'm extracting movie titles out of some MySQL database via Scoop at the same time. And then these both say that they will go to this join node, and all this join node does is wait for both of its dependencies to finish, and when they're both done, we can move on to wherever it says to go next. And in this example, maybe it's a Hive action that actually creates Hive tables based on both the output of Pig and Scoop together and joins them together and filters them out to create your final results. And at that point, we can say that we're done and go to the end of this workflow. So how would that translate into an XML file, a workflow.xml file for Oozie? Well, it might look something like this. I've simplified it, so I've taken out all the guts of the specific configuration of the different actions, just so you can see the structure here. So you can see within XML here, we have our start node here specified, and that start node says where to start from. So it says look for a node named fork node, and fork node here is a fork type node that specifies the following things should run in parallel at that point. So this says create a fork and kick off Scoop node and Pig node at the same time. So at that point, Oozie would say, okay, Scoop node, what do you want me to do? And there'd be a bunch of configuration here that says exactly what Scoop should execute and what its command should be. And at the same time, it will look up Pig node and run its configuration as well. So this will specify some specific Pig file that it wants to run in parallel as well. And you can see both of these say OK to joining, and that means that when they're finished, they're going to go to the node named joining next. So these both point to this join node as the next step. And you can see there's also an error condition that goes to a fail node. So if you can also say, well, if something goes wrong, jump to someplace else where we'll fail out. But in this case, they're both pointing to joining, and all that join node will do is wait for everything connected to it to finish. And once it's done, it will have a to property that says where to go next. So at this point, we're going to go to our Hive node, which is another action. And this contains a Hive configuration that would contain information about exactly what Hive script to run. And when that's done, it's going to go to end, or if it fails, it will go to fail. So you can see that if we do fall through to fail at any point, it will just print out a message and kill itself. And the end node is just the end node. It's a special end type that says that Oozie is done with this workflow. So at a high level, that's what a workflow might look like conceptually in Oozie, and also more specifically what it would actually look like within XML. So remember, in Oozie, you specify workflows through XML files. You would think, perhaps, that there would be some fancy editor for actually setting these things up, but there isn't. Your editor is your XML editor. So, how do you actually set up a workflow in Oozie in practical terms? Well, first you want to make sure that every individual action works on its own. So you want to make sure that you develop and test everything ahead of time, because debugging things within Oozie is not easy. So it's much better to work out any issues outside of Oozie before you try to tie them together with Oozie. Then you'll make a directory in HDFS on your HDFS file system that contains the configuration for your job, and that's where you'll put your workflow.xml file that actually contains all the specifics that describes your workflow into that folder that you created on HDFS. At that point, you can also create a job.properties file that will just sit on your local hard drive from whatever machine you're going to kick off this Oozie job from, and in there you can define any variables that might be referenced by your workflow.xml file. So that provides a mechanism for actually writing a workflow.xml file that can be used on different servers or, work within different directories and things like that. You can abstract that information away and put it inside your job.properties file. So for example, here's a closer look at the job.properties file that we're going to use in the example for this lecture. And you can see here we've actually abstracted out the specific host name and port that the HDFS name node is running on, the specific host name and port that the Yarn job tracker is running on, the queue name, and a couple of parameters for Oozie itself, including the path that this Oozie application is actually installed into. And that itself actually refers to the name node variable up here. So by doing that, we can refer to $name node and $job tracker, for example, within our workflow.xml file, and the specifics of how this particular cluster is administered and what ports things run on change. That's easy to take care of without actually going through your workflow.xml file and looking for every place that that's referenced. To actually run it, you just go to your master node in your cluster, whatever that might be, and type in Oozie job --Oozie with a parameter to where you want to run the Oozie console, and -config to wherever the job.properties file is that you want to set up your job from, -run. And remember, the actual directory in HDFS where the Oozie workflow.xml file is stored is within your job.properties file, and that will just kick it off. And at that point, you can go to the Oozie web console, which is just a read-only tool. It just tells you the status of jobs that are running. You can't actually change or edit things there at all. But if you go to that address in your browser, then you can actually take a peek at what's going on, and if something goes wrong, you can at least look at the log files from there. So in addition to workflows, Oozie also has a concept of coordinators. So it's all well and good that we can tie different actions in Hadoop together with a workflow, but what you really want to do in production is schedule the execution of that workflow on some periodic basis. And that's what a coordinator does in Oozie. So basically, you can give a coordinator a given start time and a frequency that it should run at. So for example, maybe you want a certain workflow to kick off at 7 p.m. tonight and then run every 24 hours, once a day, pretty much forever. The other good thing about a coordinator is that it can wait for any required input data to become available. So if your workflow depends on a certain directory full of information to exist before it can start, then the Oozie coordinator will actually wait for that to show up if it has to. And you kick it off in exactly the same way that you would launch a workflow. It's just that your XML file looks a little bit different. So now we have a coordinator app type instead of a workflow, and that just contains some controls that specify various properties of the coordinator and the path of the XML file that you actually want to coordinate. So that's coordinators in a nutshell. Again, you would think that there might be some fancy UI for setting these things up or some web-based UI, but Oozie itself does not provide one. It just provides a read-only view into what coordinators exist and when they are executing. Now, there are some packages, some vendors like Cloudera that do have a Oozie manager of their own that does allow you to edit these things in a graphical manner. So, that's sort of a nice little bonus of the Cloudera environment. Finally, there's a concept of bundles in Oozie. This is a new thing in Oozie 3.0, and just like a coordinator can schedule the execution of your workflows, a bundle is a collection of coordinators that can all be managed together. So in larger organizations, this can come in handy. Let's imagine that you have a bunch of coordinators that kick off jobs for processing log data in various ways. So maybe there's a bunch of different departments within your larger organization that have many jobs that depend on processing log data. Maybe somebody's interested in extracting customer behavior data for the purpose of personalization or providing recommendations. Maybe someone else is more interested in web analytics, just seeing, where people come from, where they're clicking off to, and patterns in user behavior. But you might have several workflows and several coordinators that are all processing the same source data or doing the same conceptual thing. So it could come in handy to actually group all those coordinators together into a bundle, because imagine there were a problem with log collection itself. And this is actually not an uncommon problem in the real world. Well, if you have all those things in a bundle, then you can turn off all those different coordinators at once altogether. So say you have a bundle of log collection coordinators. If there's some issue with log collection and you need to pause everything until things get resolved, you could just turn off that entire bundle and turn it back on once whatever issue with log collection is done. And that can save you a lot of work from an operational standpoint if you're in that sort of a situation. Now, creating and managing bundles is actually surprisingly complex, so I don't want to get into the details of it, but just want you to know that that's a new feature and it does exist that can make your life a little bit easier if you're a Hadoop administrator in a very large organization. So with that, let's actually get our hands dirty with Oozie. Let's set up a couple of little Hadoop actions that we can tie together using Oozie. So for one thing, we'll put our movie lens data back into the MySQL instance on our little Hadoop sandbox, if it's not still there. And I'm going to write a little Hive script that will find all the movies released before 1940. And what I'll do is set up an Oozie workflow that uses Scoop to extract all the movie information from MySQL, and then analyze that using Hive. So it's just going to be a simple two-step workflow in Oozie, one that uses Scoop to extract data from MySQL, and then another action that depends on that to analyze the extracted information directly using Hive. So let's go fiddle with Oozie.